We are going to have a report back from the anti-war delegation to Venezuela. And we recently had a delegation organized by the U.S. Peace Council and led by Ajamu Baraka from the Black Alliance for Peace. So I'm going to invite Sara Flounders up here, who is the coordinator of the International Action Center, to give us a report back. Thank you.
Greetings. Just listening to the reports before me, it's clear that both we never rest and the U.S. war machine never rests. It's always scheming and planning, and every country in the world is in its crosshairs, and every gain for any population in the world is immediately a threat to global corporate domination. That's the way they see it. They don't see this as an advance for humanity. It's like, uh-oh, there's more people having a role, a decision-making. That's a threat. Now, Venezuela has done so much to alleviate enormous poverty, advance education, build health care for millions who were just ignored in the past by U.S.-friendly regimes. And it's their accomplishments that have made them an arch enemy of U.S. imperialism. That's why they're being targeted. Of course, they're also targeted because they have the largest oil and gold reserves in the world and a lot of other very valuable resources. And of course, U.S. imperialism wants their hands on that. They want to have the control of it. So it was a real honor and an opportunity to participate in this delegation to Venezuela. It was organized by the U.S. Peace Council, and our host was COSI, which is the Committee of International Solidarity in Venezuela. Excuse me, I came back with quite a cold. Now, I've been active more than 50 years in movements for revolutionary change here in the U.S., the belly of the beast, as we call it. And I've also been on solidarity delegations to countries in the midst of U.S. wars and strangulating sanctions and shortages and cuts in Iraq, in Gaza, horrendous conditions, where you could also see organized human resistance. In Syria and in Yugoslavia during U.S. bombing and massive destruction of everything that had been built. What's always the first thing targeted are the schools and the health clinics. And then potable water. Now, in Venezuela, I want to say I saw the most radical solutions to every one of the very real problems of U.S. imperialism that they just pile on when they're determined to bring a country down. And it means that countries and struggles learn from each other, learn new ways of resisting, and also they learn the script and what they can and should expect. They've learned the importance of mobilizations that hold the population together, because always the aim in U.S. wars is, they know any of these countries are no military threat, so they're not trying to take out any military equipment. The aim is to create trauma. It's psychological warfare. So what I saw in terms of resistance made me very optimistic about Venezuela's ability to resist. They know what they're up against. It's people power that changes history. Mobilized people power it's a material force. We should be confident of that. People power, when it's mobilized, has the ability to push back the aggressive hand of U.S. imperialism. Now, when I was there, I had an opportunity to participate in one of these huge demonstrations. They've been taking place every Saturday since the U.S. attempted coup, every single Saturday in tens of thousands. And that's not the first time. That's throughout the 20-year history of the Bolivarian Revolution. Again and again, people come out in these giant mobilizations that just fill the avenues, and it's hundreds and hundreds of buses and people organized by their unions and their schools and their colectivos. it's really quite an incredible thing to see. There's also an awareness that any strike by the U.S., any further war, has the real risk of opening a struggle throughout Latin America. Venezuela is not alone, and we should know this. But this demonstration and the enthusiasm and the number of groups, and because we had been in the news, we were sort of, I don't know, mini celebrities for a day, so everyone wanted to run up and take pictures with the, delegation for the U.S. that was against the U.S. war. It's kind of nice to be that popular once, Doesn't happen often. And at the same time, we went right after the meeting with President Maduro to something that was just fascinating. There was a friendly people's occupation going on in front of the presidential palace. And again, it was thousands of people, and they come out for all day and into the night. And each time it's a different union or school or collectivo, and it's all incredibly organized. When we were there, and it's because of the coup, they're making a big show of support. When we were there, it was the oil workers union that was out in force. And the president of the oil workers union, he got up on the stage and he said, "We want to say we are armed and we will defend what's ours. So come on." I mean, he was really confrontational. And a lot of illusions also, and the militias are there in force. Venezuela has more than a 2.5 million community organized militia. That's different from the armed forces, which are also big, but these are community organized militias. And everywhere, in every discussion, it would be always where we're seeking collective versus individual solutions. That individual solutions, that is rooted in capitalism. If we're trying to build and go toward socialism, we have to find for everything the collective solution. Now, our delegation, by the way, arrived late because American Airlines had shut down all travel. They're the main carrier to Venezuela, shut down all travel to Venezuela. Some folks, it took them a couple days to arrive. And also, the attack on the electric grid had just happened. There was no power anywhere in Venezuela, so planes couldn't even land at night. They had to, because there weren't any landing lights, literally. So they had to wait for the next day. So we were all late in arriving. Now, this attack on the electric grid, let me just say something about it, because the entire country went dark. And no electricity means no water is pumping. That means you can't flush your toilet. There's no water for cooking, for drinking, bathing. It means a metro isn't operating. Communication is down. It means gas pumps don't work. Credit card machines don't work. Elevators don't work. There are lots of high rises in Caracas. And this was true in the whole country. And during this, there was really cynical laughter from the opposition forces. And here's a former CIA director, he's now the Secretary of State, Pompeo, who's tweeting, "No food, no medicine, now no power, next, no Maduro." But that's not what happened. See, on the one hand, they actually took credit for what is a war crime, to shut off the electricity for the entire country. And that puts lives at risk in hospitals, oxygen tanks, dialysis. Just think of all that happens. People stuck in elevators, stuck in the metro. It really makes life very difficult immediately. And they're cheering about it, and the opposition is cheering about it. Now, just as a phony humanitarian delivery of food and supplies at the border, remember on February 23rd when they were going to break in with all this supplies? We were on Wall Street, there were demonstrations all over. And the idea then was that this would split the military in Venezuela. And it didn't happen. The military didn't break, and the people's militia sure didn't. So their next idea was this total darkness of the power grid would lead to rebellions, looting, chaos, a complete breakdown in society. And they actually printed news articles before it happened that that's what was happening. It's not what happened. Now, we know here in the U.S., New York City, in L.A., tens of thousands of people who in their gut understand deeply that their lives and their futures are stolen will take an opportunity, if the power goes out, to take back a fraction of what's stolen. That's a fact. The lights go out, things will be chaotic. In Venezuela, it was the opposite. It was overwhelmingly orderly for 5 and into 7 days of this as the power winked off and on. There were lines for water, for emergency supplies, or water tanks and trucks that went around. But the complete chaos, which their plan was that would be the first step into this intervention they want to do, didn't happen. And being there and seeing this, and seeing literally how orderly it was quite an accomplishment in its own right. Now, getting the power back on, it's sort of amazing it did take place in 5 to 7 days. I think about it, in Puerto Rico, it's almost a year just to get power back in many isolated areas. So to have electricity back in the whole country, it was, they later described in some detail, caused by a failure in the hydroelectric plant known as Algeria, and then cyber attacks, and then explosions at substations. It was a very calculated thing. There was even an article in Fortune, which is called The Capitalist Tool, Fortune magazine, describing exactly how they would organize such an attack. The U.S. is to blame in another way, not only for that attack, but for years of denying the equipment to upgrade the system. And that's an important thing, too. Now, I want to say something on the sanctions, because the sanctions are, Venezuelans say that they have the harshest sanctions of any country in the world, and the largest in sheer number that are regulating and strangling everything, blocking all banking services, all credit cards, all sale of oil, they have large gold reserves. They can't buy things around the world in gold. They can't use the SWIFT banking system. Any country that sells to Venezuela has problems with U.S. banking and so on. And all of this is to restrict the government's ability to provide the most basic needs. So it takes a lot of creative solutions to survive U.S. sanctions. Was also in Venezuela what made cash almost irrelevant. There was more than 3,000% hyperinflation. It did create financial chaos, which, along with the assassinations and the provocations, were an enormous everyday problem to deal with. On the other hand, there's 20 years of coping in Venezuela with coups and sanctions and a lot of other things. In many ways, and it was like a laughing joke, we watched actually program after program, Juan Guaido is really the joke of the country. That here is this completely insignificant, almost unknown politician who gets up and declares himself president of the country and is immediately recognized by the U.S. and every one of the countries in their sphere, which is, I think, 53 countries have now, all the NATO countries, all the imperialist allies, and a lot of other countries that are just dependent countries that aren't able to stand up. But out of 180, 86, 89 countries, that's still not significant, but it's the countries that wield imperialist power. So it's a real problem. If anyone gets up and is immediately recognized, no election, no laws, not based on anything. And on top of this, it's not only recognition, it's handing to this insignificant, reactionary, racist, backward politician the entire resources and assets of Venezuela. I mean, $11 billion in assets, and Citgo and Chevron, all the. So it's not just political recognition. At the same time, what was happening was Elliot Abrams was appointed the special representative for Venezuela by ex-CIA Director, Secretary of State Pompeo. And it's important to know who Abrams is, because throughout the years of the war in Central America and the plannings for the Iraq War, he was the #1 guy in terms of really vicious war plans, and willing to use the most, death squads and mercenaries very openly, and brag about it, write about it. They and Trump again and again pose this as part of the global struggle against socialism. We should know how they see it. This is how they see it. And this is why they're determined to stop Venezuela. It's a direct threat on Cuba. It's a threat on every progressive gain in Latin America. And it's sending a message, as Trump said, right here. Now, how long am I talking? Personally, I want to say the most interesting visit, since I'm a gardener, was to the Ministry of Urban Agriculture. Madeline Arias is the director of this, and we visited with her and her staff for a whole afternoon. She said we're the only country in the world to have a whole government ministry that's focused on quickly developing urban agriculture. And what it is totally organic gardens that this year alone will produce 25% of Venezuela's food needs. That's quite an accomplishment. And they're using backyards and empty lots and small greenhouses. They have it, the half acre produces this and 1 acre that, and rooftop this, and empty lot of 3 acres this, and what can be planted and what kind of seeds and what rotation, and 100% organic, because, of course, fertilizers and pesticides and all that are cut off in the sanctions, plus they're not healthy. Using these urban gardens also cuts out the black market and the distribution and the shipping and the storage. And as they say, Venezuela has the climate and the ability to produce 3 and 4 crops a year. So this is really possible to do without huge problems of storage. It will be, as I say, 100% organic, and within the next few years, they expect it'll provide 50% of all their needs. And we said, well, where is the experience on this? They said, well, we're getting special advice and assistance from Cuban, Vietnamese, and Korean experts. Small agricultural solutions on how to deal with near-famine conditions created by U.S. sanctions and wars. So that's the kind of assistance. When I say they're learning and drawing on, they're also developing fish farms, and we were talking to them, they already had 260 large fish ponds that are good for fertilizer and protein, of course. There's more planned. There's a lot of effort being put into rabbit raising. And the barrio that we visited had plans for every family to raise rabbits because it's easy and clean and it provides high protein, and you can feed rabbits vegetable scraps, and everyone knows that rabbits reproduce very easily. About 8 to 10 litters a year and 8 to 12 bunnies in a litter, that's... You can solve a lot of problems with the bunnies. And there are other larger local farming efforts also that'll be fully organic, with having to do with chickens and cattle and pigs and whatnot. But especially the purpose of this ministry is to teach healthy eating and healthy habits to the young. They said we went from being a country of huge malnutrition to a country facing obesity. You can't just give out inexpensive food to lots of people. They need to learn the eating that's healthiest for them. So by increasing vastly the fruit and the vegetables that are available, and there's all kinds of cooking classes and all kinds of other things like that. And the idea is every neighborhood, this is why I say it really empowers people, that they won't starve in the event of war, in the event of things becoming worse, that they can provide for themselves and their children, and this is all being organized on a collective basis. So it reinforces, it's all organized by the collectives, even deciding where the farms are set up, and every group of 200 families can organize itself and apply directly to the government and get these packages and advice. So it encourages collective action. Now, humans also need more than veggies and fruit and meats. So that's where the clap boxes come in. What the U.S. sanctions have been able to do is create crises by withholding whatever product people need you suddenly couldn't buy. I mean, there was at one time a complete scarcity of toilet paper. You couldn't purchase it anywhere. It was hidden away in warehouses. Another time it's coffee, and another time it's sugar. And so this creates real stresses in the population. So they began a program, and it is distributed to 6 million families. Now, 6 million families is about more than 2/3 of the population. You get either biweekly, and other places monthly, a box of 19 to 20 basic supplies. That includes corn and milk and coffee and cans of tuna fish and powdered milk, salt, shampoo, soap, personal hygiene products, essential paper products, beans, cooking oil, flour, rice, all kinds of things that are needed. And it's distributed, again, through the community councils, which is a really all-out effort to cut down on the corruption when it was handled through food distribution and warehouses that the upper classes have their hands on, and they would hoard and sell and put on the black market and whatnot. So the fact that everyone has these basic food supplies is a big, big step in both support for the government and people's confidence among themselves, and again, strengthening these units of collective. So even our hosts in COSI, all of them, they all rely on these food boxes. Let me say something about the community councils. From the earliest days of the Bolivarian Revolution, what were formerly really around Caracas, or every big city, and this is true everywhere in the world, there's a city center, and then there are huge urban areas where there's just no plumbing, no sanitation, barely electricity, really shanty towns, favelas, barrios that where nothing is working, and the housing is outrageous, and there aren't schools and whatnot. So the biggest accomplishment was in all of these neighborhoods putting in roads and storm drains and electricity and plumbing and painting of houses and rooftops. I mean, the basic things. We visited two of the barrios where, to us at least, it certainly looked like there was 100% support for the whole revolutionary process. For example, Katia, which is on the hills to the west of Caracas. Now, this isn't just a small district. 1.5 million people live in Katia. We visited their community gardens and rabbit breeding program, and met with the community council, saw where the militia trained. There was also another neighborhood called the February 23rd neighborhood, and that's where President Hugo Chavez really the revolutionary leader of Venezuela, is buried in a sort of a fort overlooking the January 23rd neighborhood. Now, the community councils decide all the development in these neighborhoods, and they're the ones who meet with the government on what kind of plumbing, what sort of lighting, what's needed in the area. And as I said, a community council is a group of about 200 families. They apply for government recognition, and direct government aid is distributed through them. And then 8 to 10 community councils form a commune. Now, a commune, people are elected at each level, and it really is an effort at a stronger and different form of participatory democracy than what we know in bourgeois democracy. And it really creates a functioning popular power base of a network throughout the whole country that is involved in immediate problem solving, kind of energizes the whole population, and they see this as really a contribution. And in earlier time, this is something that even Marx described in the Paris Commune. I mean, it's not like this is the first experience in this, but it's very highly developed in Venezuela. And the commune represents not only the community councils, but also represented in the communes and elected and deciding of the decision-making in a commune is the militia and the unions and organizations of the disabled and women's organizations, LGBTQ organizations. This is really all represented in each of the communes, and there are about 500 communes around the country. And that was really the force behind the Constituent Assembly. And they're in all the poor and all the working class communities. And they're actually the biggest break against all the efforts to create chaos and utilize internal sabotage and create rumor mongering. It's always the community councils that step in and meet with people and explain what's going on. Let me say also something I found really impressive was on housing, and I must have asked them to repeat it about 6 times, even different people we met with. Is this really the number? But since 2016, so this is in the last 3 years, three maybe beginning 4 years ago, the Maduro government, this is an initiative of President Maduro. They've built 2.5 million new housing units all over the country. That's huge. It means new housing, a housing unit is, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, depending on the size of the family. So it's new housing for almost a third of the population. It's not just in Caracas, all over the country. There are entire new cities and new towns that have been built. And every housing complex comes with surrounding services of schools, daycare centers, medical clinics, bakeries, groceries, cafes, playgrounds, transportation, community gardens, and other such things. Now, 2.5 million housing units. Think about that. In the U.S. today, total in terms of low-income housing is just over 1 million housing units. There's hardly any low-income housing that's been built in about 40 years in the U.S. And yet, certainly, the possibilities are there. The very fact that Venezuela could build 2.5 million housing units and all of the other services around it is quite an accomplishment. It was also a huge jobs program at a time when there was every effort to shut down the economy. And instead, people were building their own homes, their own new communities, and they're very popular. There's also another program that's building like community centers all over, both in the older neighborhoods and in the new areas. And the community centers are the same everywhere, but they have sports all sorts of sports and gym and workout facilities and art and theater, and then community meeting rooms. And we said, well, could the opposition meet in a meeting room here? They said, meeting rooms are for everybody. We said, really? Would they meet? They said, oh yeah. Then their children come to the sports programs and and the other programs. So there's an effort to also use a lot of political persuasion. And they have what's called it's like a sub-ministry of peace, which is trying to cool out and calm things and cut what has been, and we've seen its impact in Honduras and Mexico, with the infusion of drugs and despair and demoralization of large number of gangs. We know it here, we know it everywhere in the capitalist world, but this is something that they're also very actively thinking about and coping with in Venezuela. Now, let me wind up. I want to leave a lot of time for discussion. The Ministry of Health was probably the most sobering of the visits because such an effort had been put into building health clinics, training doctors, medical technicians of all kinds, and really ensuring medical care for everyone. And the sanctions are absolutely calculated now at cutting off. Venezuela receives less than 20% of essential medicines. Essential medicines. That means medicines for diabetes, epilepsy, cardiovascular, the most essential medicines are now extremely hard to get. And they said it's a real problem because you can have a doctor and a clinic. It doesn't mean you have the diagnostic equipment. It doesn't mean you can provide essential medicines. Now, a lot of this, and this is where international solidarity comes in, are now, because it's created a real shortage and a crisis, are now coming in from China, Russia, from other countries, from Iran, very determined to, in every way, help Venezuela. But there's always that point of dislocation. Because as I said, look, we were a rich country. We have huge reserves. We have money all over the world. We're selling oil and gold. We can buy these medicines, except we're not allowed to. Even through the World Health Organization, where it's been fully approved, but the final step is run by somebody who's a Republican U.S. appointee. I want to say one other final word on finding radical solutions to real problems. Hyperinflation, 3,000%. What's the solution? There may be no solution to what, on a mega scale, the U.S. is doing, but here's what they had to do immediately. The metro is free. Buses are free. Gas is free for cars. Just food is all but free in these food deliveries. Electricity and water, there's no charge. Because it became impossible to charge for anything in the capitalist market, with it changing from almost the minute you would make a payment before it went through. So the only solution to keep a modern society running is just do away with the cash. So that was kind of exciting. I wanted to tell the People's MTA about free metros, free subways. Anyway, there's so much to report. We had almost a 2-hour meeting with President Maduro. This was very exciting for us. It was really a high point. And he really posed this. He said, look, this is a 200-year struggle between Monroe and Bolivar, between Western domination and our determination to be a sovereign nation. Except now, he said, as Trump tells us, as Pompeo tells us, it's socialism against capitalism. And that's true, too. So, and he described both the measures that they're taking, the shutdown of the electricity, their determination to repair it, and so on. So it's really, I'm going to wind up by saying that it's finding the most radical solutions to very real problems that we saw there. It gave us a great deal of confidence. We should just be aware that U.S. options are running out. They're using the same script as they become smaller on a world scale, that there are other countries that are determined to give aid and supplies and trade and to be with Venezuela. That's very important. And in Venezuela, they give enormous weight to international solidarity. Of course, material solidarity. But the fact that there were demonstrations around the world with Venezuela, as soon as we finished the meeting, Sara Martin, who's with Women Against Military Madness in Minneapolis, she said to President Maduro, "We're having a demonstration right now in Minneapolis. It's going on." And so when we went outside, he immediately sent, "Here's a tweet, here's a message to the people of Minneapolis who are here with us today." So it means that they placed just the greatest, they were excited, everyone, to hear about what's planned for March 30th, to hear about all the activities. I mean, this is really life and breath to a country under struggle. So we should just be aware of that. The balance of forces in many, many ways is changing on a world scale. The struggle is very difficult. Venezuela is absolutely in the front line, but not defeated, determinately resisting, and we stand with them. That was very much the chant, Victoria Popular. The first question I was asked about how do we handle the charges about Maduro is corrupt. The U.S. has never targeted any country without first going through the most incredible, vicious, calculated, endless stories of demonization. Suddenly, there can be an electoral process that jumped through 25 hoops and had 2,000 election inspectors, and Venezuela had thousands of inspectors. And whoever is a president is a dictator, and a corrupt dictator, and a bloodthirsty dictator, and everything else. So there's no way you can ever answer their charges. The best way to know that a country is really targeted is suddenly you learn who here knows almost any world leader, but you know Saddam Hussein, and you know Assad in Syria, and you know Gaddafi in Libya. You know Milosevic in Yugoslavia. So it's the same thing with Chavez and now Maduro in Venezuela. There's an elaborate electoral process. And the other part of it is there is a really entrenched and large and based on privilege and based on racism in Venezuela, a reactionary upper class and middle class. That are firmly with the U.S. and completely against this process. I mean, you'll see a huge number of wall paintings for Maduro, for the revolution, but you'll also see muerte colectivos, death to the collectives. And they'll be referred to as thugs and criminals and gangs and whatnot, all the media here. So demonization is a real weapon of war, and it's so relentless in every form of media that its effort is to just alienate and quiet any kind of support. He's overwhelmingly popular. I mean, just 2.5 million housing units, and food for two-thirds, three-quarters of the population would go a long way. But also really popular measures like that. Okay, the next point on what Milos said about Sunday and it being the 20th anniversary. U.S. war in Yugoslavia. Now, this was a figure from them, not from Yugoslavia. They bombed 438 schools and 14 tanks. See, that's got to tell you what they're really aiming at when they fight a war. And the reason for hitting almost every school in the country was it's not only where children learn, but it's a community center. It's also the library and the meeting room and the gym and everything else. It's an effort to demoralize the population. And so saying we don't forget that war and being in solidarity, there's a very important conference in Belgrade this weekend also marking it. So making that connection to wars is very important. Taking note at the same time of the political climate, and I'm glad Fatima raised Sunday is also the rally against xenophobia and Muslim attacks on Muslims. And it really is a rally in response to that horrendous massacre in New Zealand. But that massacre didn't happen alone. It's absolutely part of the climate in this country and around the world that is being whipped up in order to justify wars in the Middle East. So first, demonize Muslim people. So let's try to pay attention to both events. To Brother Shep's comment, the Afro-Brazilians, the way this is posed again and again is that the U.S. war and the U.S. sanctions are really a war against black and brown people, are a racist war, that the overwhelming majority of the Venezuelan population are people Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Venezuelan, indigenous people, but of course the upper class and the wealthy are overwhelmingly white. And that division, you really see it in the neighborhoods, you see it in the barrios, you see it in who the opposition spokespeople are, and the way the media used to be, the way the media is now. So it's very much a part of the way the struggle is seen and the racist character of the opposition. And that was also true when there were the opposition demonstrations. They actually grabbed and lynched. I mean, they killed simply black workers who were going to the wealthiest neighborhoods. There were people who were burned alive by these opposition mobs. So their political character, we got to really know who they are. Now, there also are folks in the Venezuelan opposition who aspire to having money and position and prestige. You know, not everybody is with the revolutionary process. That's a fact. I mean, just to be reasonable about this and to have a real honest evaluation and view. But it's overwhelmingly popular. But there is always that struggle between collective and individual action. And there are folks who want to come here. There was a sales clerk who spoke to me and said, well, I want to go to the U.S. because I want to become rich. I said, you have money now? No. I said, well, if you come to the U.S. as an immigrant, what conditions do you think you'll face? Said, I'll get rich. Oh, all right. But that's the illusion. That's the illusion. And it shapes the consciousness of people and blots out the reality around them. The question about Cuba's role from the very first day was so vital in this, in Venezuela actually learning the relationship between Fidel and Chavez is something that Chavez always described. This really gave him a view of what he was facing and how to rally the population. And it's also been true in just thousands of doctors, medical technicians, and technicians of every kind who have gone to Venezuela, who've gone all over the world. Cuban doctors, there are more Cuban doctors in Africa than the World Health Organization. You know, so Cuban solidarity is just extraordinary. Actually, Cuban doctors run the entire health system in Haiti today. You know, this is really the reality. on the GMO products being outlawed. That's true. Even before the urban agriculture, Venezuela had outlawed GMO products, and that's one more reason big ag, business, corporate ag business in the U.S. particularly hates them. What was the first thing that happened with NAFTA in Mexico? We shouldn't forget this. It just overnight wiped out millions of Venezuelan small peasants as huge amounts of corn from the U.S. was just shipped in at rock bottom prices. So now, one other thing. See, there are huge developments that are happening on a world scale that are going to get away from the U.S. no matter what they do. Look at this uprising in Algeria. I mean, there's tens of millions of people in the streets. There are things that the U.S. and their war plans can't plan about. There are eruptions that come from below. And there will be eruptions in response to their wars. So these are the kind of things we should have real confidence in, the power of people in motion to just change the complete plan that the U.S. thinks that they have carefully blocked out, and that they can just threaten and everyone will again bow down and go back to the way things were. So we should just look to extraordinary things that are happening, like what's going on right now in Algeria. But we should also know that we look for and live for that potential right here, that you can't just drive down conditions here further and further and further and not expect that there'll be a real response. I'm sorry, there was a question also on the unions. The unions are extremely powerful in Venezuela, and all the workers are organized into all different kinds of unions, and where it's small workplaces, that's where the colectivos come in. Also, it's a very important that the workers are organized, and there are all kinds also of union delegations to Venezuela that have been there in the past, and delegations that are planned going forward in the future, because there's a lot to learn from the process, and the Venezuelan unions are very excited to host delegations of workers from the U.S. and other delegations all around the world.